Hey, everybody. I hope all of you are doing well. It's almost the new year. I'm not sure when this will actually get published or when you will listen to it. So I will go ahead and wish all of you a very happy new year before I get into what this message is about. Some of you who are on Facebook might have seen the comments that I left on a post back from the beginning of October. If you aren't on Facebook and you haven't seen it, this has to do with the two ladies who I had recently become friends with, Betty and Jane. They were mother and daughter, respectively, and they were 98 and 70, respectively. So Betty passed away early in the evening on December 29th. She was 10 days away from turning 99. We were supposed to have some German chocolate cake. I told her I would bake one for her birthday. I met Betty and Jane sometime toward the end of August. Jane had asked me if I would be willing to do some work around her place for her, and she would pay me for my time. And if you're on Facebook, you may have seen me post a couple of pictures involving some of what I had been helping them do. They had a pretty extensive hoarding situation going on, and Jane had expressed interest in wanting to donate some of the things and get the place a bit more organized. And I agreed, but after a few days of trying to sort through the things that she wanted to keep and the things that she wanted to donate, it was becoming apparent that she was not interested in donating anything. So I was doing the best that I could to try and condense her things down as much as I could, so I could at least make some more space in their home in order to be able to move around more. The only places Betty could fit her walker was from her chair in the living room to her bedroom door, which was maybe just about 10 steps, and then out the front door. That was it. She couldn't get her walker into any other area of the house or into her bedroom. She used her furniture and the wall and her cane in order to steady herself to get inside her room to make it to her bedside commode. I had quickly come to the realization that there was something going on with Jane, and it was this seemingly irrational attachment to things. There were certain things that she had hundreds and hundreds of, and I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. She has hundreds of pairs of scissors and hundreds, possibly thousands of pens. And I'm still going around and collecting them all in gallon-sized Ziploc bags. And these are pens that she would take from every single business that she ever went to, every hotel, every casino that she played at. Any place that offered a pen, she took it. It's more pens than I had ever seen one person have. She had hundreds, if not thousands, of boxes and books of matches. So many matches. Also, I'm putting those into bins and bags for her. She has hundreds of those aim and flame lighters and hundreds of regular lighters. Thousands of pieces of silverware, and I mean thousands. Literally, if it's not thousands, it looks and feels like thousands. They were loaded into various storage bins all over the kitchen and in larger bins stacked up on the kitchen floor, and this is silverware mixed in with other kitchenware. She had dozens of can openers and dozens of corkscrews and dozens of cooking utensils. ladles and spatulas and serving spoons and whisks and measuring cups, measuring spoons. I mean, enough supplies to fill countless kitchens. But silverware was definitely the one thing that she was most incredibly attached to. And they weren't clean. None of this stuff was clean. They were dingy and dirty, covered in dust and sticky from being around grease in the kitchen. And one of the rooms that I needed to get functional real fast was the kitchen, because it was apparent that these ladies were not eating right either. So I went through and washed everything in the kitchen, every single piece of silverware. I sorted them into categories: forks, knives, spoons, miscellaneous, and I managed to eventually talk Jane into allowing me to box up the majority of the silverware, which she reluctantly agreed to. But I did ask if I could throw away some bent and broken or rusted pieces, and she said absolutely not. Admittedly, there were some that I did. I just couldn't hang on to that junk. And all around the apartment, there were just papers. Thousands of random pieces of papers. Some of them from 10 to 15 years ago. Decades of the various places that Jane has worked over the years. Her time cards and worksheets, things that she may have used if she was the manager of a place. If one side of the paper wasn't printed on, she wanted to save them all, cut them into 4 pieces, and use them as scrap pieces of paper. And this is not to say that she didn't have plain pieces of paper. She had pads of paper, legal pads, steno pads, spiraled notebooks, composition books, dozens of things that she could have used to take notes on and to write in, but she insisted on keeping all of these pieces of paper, even if they were used. When we first started sorting through some of the bins that were stacked up around the house, Jane insisted on inspecting every single scrap of paper, every receipt, every business card, just to make sure that she didn't want it. And you also have to understand that Jane and Betty, over the course of many, many years, were avid gamblers. So every paper that she got from any casino, any advertisement, any mailers that she got for offers, anytime she stayed at a hotel, she had kept that receipt, she had kept the hotel key, and she had so many VIP cards from the various casinos. Every time she withdrew money from a casino ATM, she saved every receipt, every single one of them. It got to the point where I just decided to start separating all of her papers into boxes so she could just go through them on her own. I was never going to get anything done if I was having to pick through each piece of paper one by one with her. Now you have to imagine 2 bedrooms, a living room, and hallways filled wall to wall, floor to ceiling, top to bottom, stacked up with these bins that were literally dumped full of all of the things that I've mentioned and more, mixed in with all the important papers that she might have wanted to keep. She had bills dating back 15 or 20 years, medical paperwork, folders, portfolios, empty envelopes, junk mail, just all mixed in and tossed in bins. As a matter of fact, a couple days ago, I was going through one of these bins and I found a stack of open envelopes. You know, like when you get a bill and there's an envelope that has a little plastic window? I found about 30 or 40 of those empty, used envelopes that had been torn open, and they were wrapped together and placed inside of a plastic Ziploc bag. And that's another thing that she did too. She would take like a couple of Sharpies and put them in a Ziploc bag. She'd take a pair of scissors and put it in a Ziploc bag. And that was another thing that I had to sort through, was get rid of all of these damn Ziploc bags that were holding random things that they didn't need to be holding. She would take empty coffee cans and put all of those random things that I told you she liked to collect: matches, lighters, pens, nail clippers, everything. She'd fill coffee cans full of all of this junk along with scrap papers and put the lid on it and put it in a bin. And I realized that we're coming to the conclusion here that she has this compulsion. There's something going on with her in her mind that isn't and wasn't allowing her to let go of anything. So, like I said, I started trying to sort through all of these gigantic bins with all these papers and envelopes and junk mail, and mixed in with all of this stuff are pieces of used silverware and matches and lighters and scissors and combs and nail files and Sharpies and pens and batteries and coins, and just hundreds and hundreds of those VIP cards and lanyards from every casino in Vegas and Henderson. And I mean, these bins were those big plastic bins that you buy in order to store things like in your garage, maybe holiday decorations. Every single bin was stacked, and half of them are broken, and most of them don't even have any lids. I guess the best way to describe each of these bins would be like a giant junk drawer. And Jane is aware that in the chaos that there are important papers that she's so afraid of losing. And I tried to explain to her that the state in which these bins are filled with so much junk and stacked floor to ceiling, they're already lost. And if we don't go through this stuff, you're never going to find them. And luckily for Jane, I like organizing stuff. And there were some of you who have shared the same sentiment. Like, we just like organizing things. I get it. Just like there are compulsions to be hoarding and collecting and scrolling stuff away, we have compulsions to be organized. Unluckily for me, every time I picked up a piece of paper, it caused Jane an incredible amount of stress and anxiety, wanting to see what it is and if she needed it, and so afraid that I was going to throw something important away. So needless to say, nothing in that respect was getting accomplished. Eventually, my time over there at their place began shifting from organizing into caretaking. Jane has emphysema and she has COPD, so how she had been feeling day to day, it fluctuates. Betty, on the other hand, other than being very old, didn't really have any serious health issues. She couldn't see well. She couldn't hear very well. She moved very slowly. There's always the risk of her taking a fall. And she always needed help with a lot of things. If you've provided care for an elderly person, then you understand. So throughout September and October, I was going over there once a day, and that eventually turned into twice a day. And then I started picking up prescriptions. I started running errands, going to the bank for them, getting groceries, and taking Betty to her various doctor's appointments. And those were the times that I was able to take her out to Denny's for breakfast. But I think as Jane's dependence on me grew, it may have started causing her to become even less and less physically active than she had been, which was very little to begin with. She wasn't needing to get up and move around as much because I was there, but I wasn't there all the time, so there had to have been times when she needed to do and get things on her own for herself and for her mom. But I don't know. I just assumed. I told her I thought that she needed to make an effort to get up more and move around a little bit more than she had been, but then she told me that it hurt her feelings when I said that because she took it as I was insinuating that she wasn't taking care of her mother. And that's not what I meant, but the truth is that was a fact. She wasn't taking care of her mom. I talked a little bit about what was going on with Betty and Jane in the last episode that I uploaded here before I left for California last Monday, the 21st. I wasn't even sure when I was going to be able to visit my family because it didn't seem as though Jane was really getting strong enough to manage the basic day-to-day stuff without any assistance. Though I did know Jane's husband was going to be flying in from Virginia to spend the holidays with them, so I would have at least those days while he was in town to be away in California and not worry too much about it. And I think I had explained why he's in Virginia and his wife is out here in Nevada, but in case you missed that, that's where he and Jane settled while he was with his career in the Navy, and after that, he was in defense contracting. He was going to be in Nevada for Christmas through the New Year, but things didn't exactly go as planned, and I'll get to that in a moment. I had mentioned in my last message about this that since I had returned from my visit with my family the day after Thanksgiving, which was Friday, November 27th, I went straight over to their place and I stopped in to walk the dogs first, and then I went over there to see Benny and Jane. They had a Thanksgiving dinner ordered and delivered from a local grocery store on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, so there was plenty left over, and I was fortunate enough to have a traditional dinner with the turkey and all the fixins with them on that Friday, which I didn't have with my mom and my daughter, and that's perfectly fine. There's only the three of us, so it's kind of like we're not really going through the trouble anymore. We had ordered some takeout and kept it simple, which I enjoyed thoroughly. But when I got back, I could tell that the time that I was gone was not easy on Betty and Jane. You see, towards the beginning of November, and it was actually on Election Day here in the United States, so it's easy for me to remember that, I had gone over to their place, and the plan was to have breakfast, and I was going to help the two of them fill out their ballots and assist Betty with filling everything in and guiding her with getting her signature on it, and then I was going to go drop it off in person at the polling place. But when I got there that Tuesday morning, Jane looked very sick. Her skin tone was very pale and almost kind of gray, and she had foam that had formed around her mouth. She was still coherent, so we tried to put the little oxygen meter thing on her finger, and at that time it was fluctuating between the low 40s and the high 30s, which is way too low. She needed to be well into the 90s. I think that's accurate. I'm not a nurse, or I don't care for elderly people. I don't do this sort of thing. But I put my finger into the thing to see if it was working, and I registered like a 98 or a 99, so it was working. Jane began trying some of her prescription inhalers. She turned on her nebulizer and used that. She had only been able to get her oxygen up to 45 or so, and then it plummeted again, so I called 911. When the firefighters and the paramedics came, they hooked Jane up to their equipment and got her stabilized, and they were kind of even freaked out as to how low her oxygen had dropped. In the meantime, I'm trying to give the paramedic as much information as I can. I'm not family, and at this point I had only known them for about 2.5 months. But I knew of one other family member that was nearby who they could maybe contact, and that was Jane's brother, Betty's son. I spoke to Betty and I asked her who we could call to come help her, and she said that her son Robbie would come and take care of her and take her to his house. And she was able to give the paramedic his phone number. So the paramedic called him and spoke to him and told him that he needed to get over there and he needed to take over in providing care for his mother, which he did. I think he felt compelled to because the paramedic was telling him to do it. We packed up Betty's necessities, we got her into her son's car, and they left. I had already sent an email to Jane's husband. At the time, I didn't have his phone number, and he had gotten back to me. He got himself a flight booked out here to Nevada, so until he got there, all I really needed to do was take care of Betty's cat. His name's Buddy. Betty calls him her VIC, her very important cat. And Robert arrived the next evening, so he took over the cat duty. And with that, I had some time on my own. I had somewhat of a break. So Jane was set to be discharged by the latest that Friday. She had gone into the hospital on Tuesday. But the days in between, her brother had been texting me, asking me each day, when was I going to pick up Betty? When was Jane getting out of the hospital? That he can't keep taking care of his mom for very much longer. I had met him for the first time the day that he picked up Betty. He's a few years younger than Jane. He's very tall. He's very sturdy. And from all I could see, he's quite healthy, in much, much better shape than his sister. Like I said, Betty was in good shape herself. She's just old. She still walked with her walker. She could still read her newspaper, albeit with a super bright light and a massive magnifying glass. But, she was handling it. She's still feeding herself and still going to the bathroom on her own. So taking care of her could have been way worse. By Friday morning, I was able to go over to her son's house and pick Betty up and drive her home. Jane had actually gotten home late Thursday night, and her brother bitched at her all night to come get her mom. But she just couldn't. She didn't have the energy to do it. She called me the next morning and asked if I would go pick up Betty, which I did. Jane's husband stayed for another week, so I was able to take advantage of that time that I had, and I was getting episodes done for you guys and some bonuses, and the Patreon was all published for you during that time in a timely manner. It was good catch-up time for me. So Jane's husband went back to Virginia, I believe the Monday before Thanksgiving. It seemed as though Jane had improved enough to be able to manage taking care of herself and her mom, and I went to California that Tuesday. I came back on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, and I had been over at their place twice a day, every day since. In that time, I was able to also help Jane and Betty finish up taking care of Betty's affairs. That was something that also Jane was worrying about when it came to all of her papers that she had spread all over the place. She needed to get some paperwork done with her lawyer, the living will, the DNR orders, power of attorney, all that jazz. They had started it just before the pandemic had shut everything down, so it had been sort of in limbo. But on December 4th, I took them to their very last visit with their attorney, and it was all finished. Betty was able to put her signature on every single paper that she needed to, and with that, everybody's mind was at ease. So on Sunday, December 13th, Jane had called me up in the afternoon and asked me to come over. She said she had some kind of accident, but didn't say anything more than that. I went over there and I could see that something had happened. There was something that had broken or spilled on the floor. I didn't know what it was at the time. And after I thought about it for a while, I think I kind of figured it out, but it was something that Jane didn't want to tell me. So I won't say what it was other than it was something that was very personal to her and probably too embarrassing for her to tell me. I cleaned up what I could at that time. Jane wasn't very mobile, so I told her I would come back in the morning, and that would be on Monday, the next day. We'd try to get her settled into another chair in the living room, and I'd work on cleaning up her little area around the sofa where she spent most of her time sitting and eating and watching TV and sleeping. She'd been very, very protective of everything that she had near her, and hidden in the various cushions around her. So I kind of had to just leave it alone. As much as I wanted to help her clean up that area, which it desperately needed it, I knew she didn't want to. But she had kind of sort of finally agreed to do that for that Monday. Sometime in the middle of the night, Jane had called me. I don't know what time it was. It was between Sunday and Monday. I couldn't really understand what she was saying very well. I was not that coherent because I was really in a deep sleep. I told her that I was going to be there first thing in the morning to check on her and to make breakfast, and she said okay, and we hung up. I barely even remember the conversation that we had, and she wasn't very coherent that I can remember. So the next morning I went over there, and Jane was asleep when I got there. And Betty, well, she had gotten her walker hung up in the hallway, and I found her sitting on her walker, stuck in the door jamb between her bedroom and the living room. When she saw me, she said, "Thank goodness you finally come. I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't get through the door." So I got her situated finally. I made coffee and breakfast. I talked to Jane to see how she was doing, and she told me she was okay. I gave her some coffee, but she said she didn't want any food, which kind of concerned me. I don't know how much she weighed, but since then, her husband had told me that she weighs about 90 pounds or 40 kilograms, and she's probably about 5'4", 5'5", so that's very, very underweight. But anyway, I told Jane and Betty to call me or message me when they were ready for dinner. That was our usual routine. So I went home, but I didn't hear from her. I waited until about 8:30 that night before I decided to go back over there to see what was going on. And Betty was in her usual chair in the living room, but Jane, from a distance, she looked like she was asleep, but she was more slumped over. I got closer to her and I could see that she had either vomited or had some foam around her mouth and in her hair. The tubes connected to her ventilator and to the oxygen tank had come loose and were hanging down and were not in her nostrils, and her oxygen tank was empty. So I replaced her tank and I put the tubes back in place. I tried talking to her and I gently shook her by her shoulder, but she didn't answer me. Her phone was on the floor and it was wet. She had a flip phone, so that little bit of moisture ruined her phone. I tried for a few more minutes to see if she could talk to me, but she didn't respond. She didn't even open her eyes. So I first tried calling her brother. I called 3 or 4 times. I sent a text message and told him that there was something wrong with his sister and I needed his help. He didn't answer, and he never did. So then I tried calling Jane's husband in Virginia, and he didn't answer either, but over there in Virginia, it was getting close to midnight. They're 3 hours ahead of us here in Nevada. So I tried talking to Jane again, but she was completely unresponsive, so I called 911. Her husband returned my call and I told him what was going on. I let him talk to the paramedics, and I told him that I would take care of Betty until he was able to get a flight out here. So for the next 2 days, it was just me and Betty. She was still her usual self. She was lucid. She was eating. She was asking me if I could take her to see Jane, but I told her that they wouldn't be able to let us visit because of COVID. And she said, "Is that damn thing still going on?" And I said, yes, it is, but maybe we could talk to Jane on the phone. But as it turned out, Jane had to be kept in the emergency room for a while because all the beds were full of COVID patients. So we couldn't call her. But I kept reassuring Betty that Jane was getting help and she was going to be fine. I told her her son-in-law was coming. She told me that she didn't like him, but that's okay. He can help Jane. Over the next 2 days, I was over there at Betty's house, and I was doing a very deep cleaning of the living room, and I had Jane's husband's permission to get rid of anything that needed to be gotten rid of, so I took full advantage. By the time he arrived on the 16th of December, it was livable and comfortable enough for him to be able to stay there and take care of Betty. I spent the next couple days catching up with things that I needed to do here at my place. I visited Betty a couple of times, and one more time on Sunday, the day before I left for California. While she was still somewhat with it, I could see that Jane's absence was taking its toll. Betty and Jane were very close, very close. I had come back to Nevada on Friday, which was Christmas Day. I went over that afternoon to see Betty, but she wasn't well. She was talking a little bit, but I couldn't understand what she was saying, but most of what she was saying started with "don't make me." And whatever she said after that, I don't know what it is, but it was clearly something she was concerned about us making her do. She hadn't eaten that day. I asked her if she wanted some toast. She said no. Eggs? No. Hot cereal? No. Grapefruit? Yes. I got a yes. So I fixed up a bowl of grapefruit, but I couldn't get her to eat it herself. So for the very first time since I've known her, I fed it to her. I sat there for about an hour helping her eat. You have to be careful because choking is always an issue. I gave her medications, and we had to wheel her into her bedroom to get into her bed. And also in the time that I was there for the 2 days taking care of her myself, I had arranged it so she would be able to fit her walker way into her bedroom the whole way that she needed to go before she could just get it up to the door. So she was pretty pleased with that. But it was the first time that we ever really had to wheel her into her bedroom. She'd always walked in there on her own and made her way into her bed herself. I came over the next morning and she was about in the same condition. I spent a couple hours helping her eat more grapefruit and some eggs, and I was able to get her to take her medications. I told her that I would be back again in the early afternoon so we could eat some dinner. At that time, Jane's husband and I talked about calling 911 if things didn't improve. We're not the ones that are tasked with making decisions for Betty, these kinds of decisions. Jane, by this time, was in a rehab working on getting a little bit stronger with her COPD. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So we tried contacting Jane's brother, who is the one who's supposed to make decisions if Jane is unable to. Jane's husband tried calling him, and the reason why I'm calling them Jane's brother and Jane's husband is because they have the same name, so I don't want to confuse them. But we never heard from him. He didn't answer. He didn't reply to text messages. So I went back that afternoon, and nothing really had changed with Betty. And after I started feeding her a little bit of soup, she started spitting it out. And she started spitting out her medications. So we called 911, and they came and picked her up. This was the day after Christmas. It turns out that Betty had a urinary tract infection. So I thought, okay, great, that's not too bad. They'll get some fluids in her, get her some rest and some nourishment, and we'll be able to bring her back home. So that Sunday, both Jane's husband and I took a very much needed day off. And I went back over there on Monday and started trying to sort through some of the junk. We had agreed that we needed to do this while Jane was out of the house and get as much done as possible and get this place in shape for when both of them come back and they start working on getting healthy, getting strong, and they were going to have people visit in-home nursing and also some physical rehabilitation. I wanted to open the place up and make it nice for Betty, for Jane, for everybody. So I spent this last Monday and Tuesday doing just that. But by Tuesday afternoon, late in the afternoon, Jane's husband was starting to get word that they were wanting to place Betty under hospice care, which was something we could do there in her home. I understood what they meant by hospice, but I was certain that Betty just needed to get back into her home and Jane would be home shortly thereafter and everything would be right with the world again. Jane, well, she had been deprived of oxygen. That's why she was unconscious. But this was also exacerbated by the fact that her COPD was getting worse. I don't know much about COPD, but in the little bit that I've learned since all of this happened, there apparently are 4 stages, and it is terminal, and Jane has entered into stage 4. She was put into a rehab facility, which is where she's at now, and she's expected to be there for another week or so, but she was very anxious to get home. But in the meantime, as we were getting word that they were going to transport Betty back home, and they needed to do this because of COVID and the space in the hospitals are so impacted, they wanted her home and we wanted her home. So they had somebody drop off a bunch of medical equipment for her, and when she got there, they would show us how to use it and how to take care of her. And a nurse would visit a couple times each day, and she would be made as comfortable as possible. And I was certain that we would be able to take care of her, and then when Jane got back home, Betty would be happy and bounce back to her normal self. So before I left Tuesday afternoon, I made up Betty's bed with clean linens. I made sure her electric blanket was switched on. So when she got there, she would be nice and warm. I told Jane's husband I was going to walk my dogs and get something to eat and to text me when Betty got there. And I came home and I laid down and I dozed off for a little bit. And when I woke up, I got a message from him that Betty got home, but she passed away within 5 minutes after laying down in her bed. And I'm so upset that I didn't get to see her come home. And I started having all of these really selfish thoughts mixed in with my grief. She was supposed to go to Denny's with me again. She was supposed to let me push her around in her walker when the weather warmed up. She was supposed to have some German chocolate cake with me for her birthday. We were supposed to hit up her favorite casino and play some slots and have some Bloody Marys. She was supposed to be my first 99-year-old friend ever. And she was supposed to help us welcome Jane back home. I only knew Betty for 4 months, but I stopped myself from feeling robbed of these things that we were supposed to do. And I told myself, Betty spent 98 years living and doing things, and to just be grateful that I had these 4 months. She was tired and old. She was done eating at Denny's. She was done pushing that walker around everywhere. She still was my first 98-year-old friend ever, and I'm still going to have some German chocolate cake when she would have become my 99-year-old friend on January 8th. I miss you, Betty. Thank you for being my friend. I'll be back soon with a regular episode for you guys. Thanks for your patience and understanding, and I love you guys very much.